Hello everyone and welcome to week three's week so far video on writing the self and the body this week. It's been wonderful to read all of your work in the workshops this week, and there's been some really varied examples. Louise has been going through that this week and giving you some tips and advice. And I'm just here really to recap some of the things that have come up in terms of the theory and the concept of writing in the body. So, the first thing to think about really is how our relationships work with our bodies in terms of writing. And in many ways, this might be variable. So, it could vary in terms of how healthy we are and how um, for instance, in times where you might be undergoing pain or not feeling as healthy, then that's going to have some sort of effect probably on your writing and um, the capacity you have for writing, the sort of things you write about, the sort of things you're preoccupied about. Um, or it might be something as simple as the sort of posture of your body and the stance of your body and how it feels to write and to do the act of writing itself. So perhaps you find it easier to type on keyboards. And it's interesting to also think about whether that's going to change the nature of the work you produce in terms of interacting with a keyboard interface rather than putting pen to paper um, and having your own sort of unique handwriting, which is the interface between your body and between the paper. So um, all of these potentially can have an effect on the content of what you write, I think. And this week was all about really analysing that and thinking about the implications of the body. You might also think about how the weather affects you and your lifestyle. So usually I teach this module in the winter time, and around about this week three or so, the weather's getting cold, it's getting dark. There's a tendency to sort of want to hibernate and to shut down. And I think it's important to remember that as writers, we are creatures, we are, living creatures, and we're subject to the world around us and the conditions and the weather, and they have an effect on our moods as well. So um, I think it's also interesting to think about how conscious you are of your body as you write, and I think sometimes in intense concentration, you might lose awareness of your body. And I remember speaking to um, some students who find writing to be therapeutic if they're struggling with an aspect of their life, and because it's a form of escape essentially. So these are all the sorts of things that you might discuss and meditate upon in terms of the body. In terms of theory, and in terms of the theory tackled this week, we looked at Lakoff and Johnson's orientational metaphors. And this is really looking at the way that language, as well as having a sort of shifting sense of what it signifies, the sign and what it signifies, we have this sort of inbuilt code within it in which, well, Lakoff's example is that directional metaphors, for instance, figurative metaphors can often be directional. So, for instance, we things that are more tend to be associated with going up, and things that are less with going down. And linked to that, rationality is often thought about as being an up quality, and the irrational as being down. We talk about emotionally feeling, if you're feeling up, feeling positive, these tend to be directional, and if you're feeling depressed, you're feeling down. So language has these hidden codes and meanings within it, that are sort of cultural. They will change from culture to culture and language to language. But it's interesting to think about. There's no such thing really as a sort of neutral, fixed type of language that doesn't have these cultural shifting associations as part of that. And someone made a joke, a very corny family joke about asking, "Oh, are you all right?" And the answer being, "No, I'm half left," and that sense of which isn't that funny. So, but there's a sense of basically playing with those shifting signifiers. Um, yeah. So, in terms of another thing that makes me think about is things like cognitive behavioral theory. I used to be a counselor in high schools, and we used to work with students who were struggling at school, who often got into these fixed sort of conceptions of themselves and didn't have much of a sense of worth, or they get fixed in patterns of behavior where they get into trouble, and it would always be, that person's making me do it. And at that level, people would say, "Oh, have you got a button on you or somewhere that they're pressing on and making you do it?" And there's just a sense that we can often fall into patterns of language that fix us in certain behaviours. In that sense, I think. So even something as subtle as changing the way you phrase your experience, and I know that counselling works like that. Being more conscious of how you frame your experience can be very liberating and empowering. And finally, we looked a little bit at Hélène Cixous and écriture féminine, and very much thinking about difficult questions to argue, but about how language might be gendered. And of course, that's a slippery subject in terms of how you might denote or identify around gender and how that might be a kind of spectrum. But really considering about whether such a thing is male writing or female writing, and what the implications of that might be. For instance, um, people have questioned that term, and it can, in historically, certainly in sort of male patriarchal systems, has been a term which has been used to diminish the achievements of the writing of women, for instance. And similarly, I've heard criticisms of what might be called sort of male writing, which is really sparse, or which is restricted, and for many years sort of held up as this canonical style in which you had to write in this particular way and be very efficient with syntax. People like Hemingway spring to mind, with associated with that, and hopefully, of course, when I'm talking about these sorts of things, I'm not saying that they are inherent or innate at all, but just that they are, well, that's a good question in itself, whether we can write from the experiences of other genders, how the ethical implications of that. Do we need to think about how we're positioned to do that, and how we might inform ourselves as writers to be able to write from different viewpoints? So these are sorts of talking points that I think arise from considering whether language is gendered or not, but it is very difficult to grasp. Okay, so just a little word before I go for the weekend, but I think it's probably worth saying that um, the the sort of dynamics and the group dynamics at the moment on the module are quite unusual, because we usually have a lot more students who are studying at this point in the course, and partly that's because this is the first time that the January start of the MA online has taken place. So we've lost sort of half of the students who are studying part time because they won't study this module until next year, which means we're left with the rest of the cohort. So with that in mind, I mean there are benefits and there are challenges to that. So the challenges are clearly to sort of maintain a sense of community. And what's really important is that we try to engage with all the different facets of the module. So particularly the discussion boards. The first port of call on any given week is to read through the course materials, after which the next port of call is to sort of engage and discuss these materials. And sometimes they'll be quite difficult to understand. They'll be occasionally like academic language and be quite dense or challenging. So it's really helpful if you can go into these modules, these discussion parts boards in the modules, and put your thoughts down and sort of share and interact with each other. And of course, myself and Louise will be there to interact as well. Um, and then the second part of that is, so as well as those discussion boards about the work, there's also your writing process, and you can experiment with little writing tasks. We have the writing tasks every week in which you can talk about your experiences and share bits of writing in quite a safe way, and talk about that together as well. And then finally, we have the writing workshops, the Google workshops, and that's where you put in, you have 1 page of A4, which you can fill with poetry or prose, in size 12 font, and that's where you can put in anything you want, but ideally that's related to that week's concept. So it was good to see that you were writing about the body in really imaginative ways this week. Um, and that's how it should be used. But the important thing about that is that you also read and comment on each other's work. So it's not there to sort of present to your module supervisors and just to sort of leave it there, because an important part of a workshop is that you interact together and that you give each other advice. There will be things you think of that teaching lecturers won't think of, and it will also increase your skills and your own reflective skills if you're reflecting on the work of others. So please do comment on each other's work as well as just posting your work up there. Because the big benefit of there being such a small cohort is that you have a lot more of our attention as lecturers. We're able to spend more time with you individually. So that's a great opportunity. And let's make the most of it. Okay, so have a great weekend, everyone, and see you next week for week 4.